Traveling is often touted as one of the best ways to learn a language, but is it really? What are some downsides of traveling to learn Chinese, and how should you travel to get the most out of it? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about traveling to learn Chinese, which hasn't really been possible for a few years during the pandemic, but which is now an option again. I've heard many people say that traveling is an awesome way to learn a language, but I mostly disagree. Sure, I think there are reasons why traveling is a great way to learn Chinese, but I also think there are some serious downsides that few people talk about, so that's what we're going to do today. Before we do that though, let's have a look at why traveling actually can be a good way to learn a language. So the first and I think maybe the most important reason is that it can boost your motivation and your self-confidence. So if we start with motivation, I think there are two things that traveling can do for you. First, it will identify what you really need to work on. So when you know in a real life situation that you were unable to do something you wanted to do, you will feel a strong urge to fix this and learn more so that next time you do this, you will be able to perform better and do the things that you want to do in Chinese. Also, when traveling, you encounter lots of things you don't know. And this doesn't have to be language related, but most things when you travel in China or in a Chinese-speaking area, of course, is mediated through the language. And so there will be lots of things you want to know more about, and then learning Chinese makes sense, and this can power your learning for months or even years after you travel. If you spend some time learning Chinese before you travel, it's also great to know that your Chinese actually works in the real world and that you can in fact learn Chinese. And if you can do this, well, there's nothing that stops you from achieving your long-term goals for learning Chinese either. Naturally, a dose of real-world Chinese will also make you realize that some things are maybe harder than you thought, and I'm thinking especially of listening ability here. The second reason why traveling is great is that it contextualizes the language you have already learned. So if you're studying with a textbook or in a course, you will learn lots of words and you will know them from specific contexts, but it's really when you use these in different contexts in the real world to communicate that you will truly figure out how they are used and maybe also how they are different in case there are more than one word that seems to mean kind of the same thing. So for example, if you're curious about how people greet each other in China, well, being in China and traveling around and listening to what people say is a pretty good way to do that. But if you stay confined to your textbook and your teacher, you won't get this kind of diversity and you will even learn some things that are outright wrong, such as people using ni hao to greet friends and family, which really isn't a thing. So when you travel, you will get exposed to a wide variety of contexts and situations which you typically don't find yourself in if you don't travel, and so you're exposed to a broader range of language and culture. This brings us to the third benefit, which is that traveling allows you to leave your comfort zone and experience new things. When you're studying on your own, you're mostly in control of what type of Chinese you get exposed to because you have to choose it yourself. And even if you're enrolled in a course and somebody else, such as the teacher, chooses what you will be exposed to and what kind of Chinese you learn, it's still fairly limited. This is a good thing if you're a beginner because you can't learn everything at once, so going full diversity from day one is not necessarily a good idea. But if you've been learning Chinese for a while, leaving your comfort zone is actually a good thing. It can push you to learn new things and realize that you can actually use Chinese to do lots of things you thought you couldn't. Benefit number 4 is that traveling allows you to experience the variety of Chinese language and culture. And like I already said, if you're confined to a textbook or just have one teacher, you will get a certain type of learning. But if you travel around and you talk to dozens or even hundreds of people, you will meet a much broader variety of language and culture. This includes various non-standard ways of speaking Mandarin, because of course normal people don't speak the way they do on the TV news or don't speak like your textbook or teacher either. When you travel around, you will meet people from all over China, and of course not just from the region you are in, because people move inside of China too. So just by being in this environment, you will encounter people from all over the place who speak in lots of different ways that you may or may not be used to. And as I've argued elsewhere, the only real option you have when it comes to dealing with regional variants is to get used to them. If you want to know more about that, I'll put a link to an article about regionally accented Mandarin in the show notes. Finally, I think that traveling to learn Chinese is a really good way to master what you have already learned. Regardless of how much time you have spent learning Chinese at home or in class, you actually need to use the language in real-world situations to learn to navigate conversations and to get feedback on how you're doing. Traveling, I think, is a great way to do this, so if you spend, say, a year in your home country learning Chinese, there is no better way to spend the summer than traveling in China. So there you have 5 reasons why I think that traveling to learn Chinese can be quite useful, but as the title of this episode implies, and as I mentioned in the introduction, I don't think that traveling really is such a good method for learning Chinese at all. And there are some obvious reasons for this, which I will go through first, and then there are some less obvious ones. So let's start with a few facts that I think everybody knows about, but which are still important to keep in mind when thinking about your learning. So the first one is that traveling is really expensive, and it's expensive compared to almost any other form of learning I can think of. And while this depends on where you live, you can probably get something like 50 hours of tutoring one-on-one instead of just buying the flight ticket. And if you're traveling mostly to learn the language, this is definitely worth considering. Traveling also takes up a lot of time, and it doesn't only take up time from your studies, it also takes up time from all the other things you're doing, which you will then need to catch up on when you come back. This also adds to the third problem, which is that traveling is inconvenient. It takes a lot of tedious work, such as applying for visas, filling in forms, buying tickets, and so on, and none of these really teach you any Chinese at all. But let's assume that you have the money to spend and you don't mind taking up a lot of your time and you're okay with the inconveniences too. This is not an outrageous assumption because, after all, these downsides are the same as when traveling for other purposes than learning a language, and this is something that most people put very high on their list of things they want to do more of. Then we get to the other downsides of traveling to learn a language that you might not have thought about. If you paid attention and are very observant, you might have noticed that when I went through the list of benefits with traveling to learn Chinese, I mostly refer to benefits relating to language you already knew before you started traveling. And this, I think, is very important because traveling can be a very good way to convert what you know passively or theoretically into some kind of practical ability you can use to communicate in Chinese, but traveling is actually a really bad way of learning new things. This is because if you don't already have a solid foundation in Chinese, it's literally impossible to pick up many words from conversations you have simply because you hear the word once or you need to use it once. And if you need to use it, maybe you look it up, you ask someone, but it will then just disappear if you don't do anything with it. This is not like learning French or Spanish, where you might hear a word and you associate it with a word you already know in English, and then it just sticks. Most words in Chinese don't work like this, unless, like I said, you already have a very solid foundation in Chinese, and then you may be able to do this. So if you travel to China with the goal of learning more Chinese, I think you will be disappointed. But if you already know some Chinese and you want to travel in order to convert this to practical language ability, because maybe when you studied in your class or in your textbook or even on your own, it was a little bit theoretical, you didn't use the language much, and this will work very well. Many of the advantages that I mentioned can also be disadvantages, especially if you are a beginner. For example, when it comes to pronunciation and how people speak, as a beginner, you don't really want variety here. You want to master the basic tones and sounds of the language. You don't want 10 different ways of speaking and some people using tones differently or pronouncing initials and finals completely differently from what you've learned. That will just lead to confusion and you aren't prepared for this type of diversity. And this is true for other areas as well, such as grammar or vocabulary. You don't really want 5 different ways of saying the same thing if you didn't know a single way of saying it before you started traveling. This, combined with the fact that it takes many exposures over time to actually learn something, traveling really isn't providing you with the structure and the environment you need to learn completely new things. If you're, say, reading a graded reader, you might encounter a new word 50 times in the same text, and you will actually learn it if you read enough. Or if you're using flashcards and spaced repetition software, it will feed you the vocabulary you've just learned, making sure you don't just see it once or twice, and then it gets forgotten. This means that some things really are better learned at home, or at least not when traveling. A good example of this is to build a basic vocabulary in Chinese, which can be done very quickly with the right methods. This requires focused and structured effort, however, rather than haphazard exposure in random chaotic environments when you happen to see a word you need, but then don't see it for another week. Well, you will of course learn new words and expressions when traveling, but this is nothing compared to what you can achieve if you focus at home. So let's use reading as an example here, because when you are in China, you will see characters all over the place and you think, yay, I get exposed to characters and I will learn them. If you knew the characters in advance, it would be great to see them in context and reinforce what you know and see how they are actually used. But if you don't know them, you won't learn them simply by seeing them on a sign here and there. Compare this with spending hours reading a text where you understand almost everything and you have time to actually absorb and learn the things you didn't know, and you can look things up if you want, and then you will also see the new characters again and again, because they are designed to teach you these things. This is particularly important if you're a beginner, because then you don't have a foundation to build other skills on, so absorbing something from your environment will become even harder. This is similar to what we talked about in episode 4 of the podcast, where we talked about why not going to China now could actually be good for your Chinese. And so the argument there is that if you have a limited time to spend in China in an immersion environment, you should not spend it immediately. You should learn the basic things that you can equally well learn at home, and then go so you can learn the things you can't easily learn at home. And the same is true for traveling, of course. So to summarize this part of the episode, I think that traveling is great for reinforcing and improving what you already know, but it's not so good for learning completely new things. Thus, it follows that if you don't know much Chinese at all, traveling won't really be that helpful. Let's move on to another downside with traveling to learn a language, and that is that you will only learn the language if you actually use it. When I went through all the benefits before, I actually made a lot of assumptions, such as that you will actually use Chinese with people you meet, that you will speak with people, and that you won't stick with English all the time, or just avoid talking to people. Because of course then most of the benefits don't even apply. This is similar to the idea that you won't simply learn Chinese by living abroad. So it's not the geographical location that determines how much you learn, it's what you do with the time. How much do you engage with the language? How much are you exposed to it? You can live in the US or Europe or in Brazil and be exposed to tons of Chinese and use it a lot. But you can also live in China for years and not learn much Chinese at all, because your interactions are mostly in English and you stick to yourself or your expat friends and family. And then it doesn't really help that you're living in China. Well, certain things gets easier, but if you don't take the opportunities to learn, this doesn't matter. So this of course does apply to traveling as well. So the fact that you are traveling in an area where people theoretically speak Chinese doesn't matter if you don't engage with people, if you don't listen to what people around you say, and if you use English when you run into trouble. So ask yourself, will I stick to Chinese even when English is a viable option? And will I speak mostly with people I travel with or with people around me, and what language will I use? And will I talk with strangers or will I mostly stick to myself? What opportunities will there be for me to use the Chinese I've learned on this trip? So depending on how you answer those questions, traveling might or might not be a great idea for improving your Mandarin. This is fundamentally about what type of traveler you are. Are you a tourist or are you someone who's willing to really explore the local language and culture? One way of defining what a tourist is to say that it's someone who takes a piece of their home country with them when traveling and stays within it. So for example, if people travel to another country, maybe to enjoy the sun, maybe to see the sights and so on, but they talk mostly with their friends, they do things roughly the way they do at home, and they really only interact with local people when they want to buy something or when there's a problem and they really have to. This is of course the most common way of traveling, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this. It's fine to be a tourist, but if your goal is to learn a language, then being a tourist is really bad. So let's say that you're planning a trip to China and you want to figure out how can I get the most out of this trip language-wise. What should you do? To begin with, I think it's a great idea to prepare as much as possible, because as I've said several times now, the more you know, the more you learn. So do your best to prepare. Next, the best thing you can do if you want to learn the language is to travel alone, because this encourages you or even forces you to engage as much as possible with people around you. Naturally, this might be out of question for a number of reasons, if nothing else because of personality. I would never be interested in traveling on my own, for example. I'm way too introverted to do that, so I prefer to travel with friends or family. But if you're not like me and you think traveling alone is okay, then this is a great way to learn more Chinese. If that's not an option though, you can also travel with non-Chinese speakers, such as your friends and family who aren't learning Chinese, because this means that you will have to communicate with everybody around you on the behalf of your friends and family. So not just your own needs and wishes, but also those around you. And then you need to interpret, and people want to say things you are normally not saying, and you get into lots of situations which are outside your normal comfort zone, and this is great for language learning. The next piece of advice is the exact opposite, to travel with Chinese-speaking friends. While this depends on what kind of friends you have, and of course you need to have Chinese-speaking friends in the first place, but if you're lucky, you will get to see many things you wouldn't have seen otherwise, and since they speak Chinese and you speak Chinese, and if you then speak Chinese in your group as you travel, this is of course also good for language learning. It's also great to have a kind of language and culture guide, so when you encounter something new that you don't understand or can't make sense of, you have someone who can explain and help out. Next up is to study while on the move. As I've mentioned already, traveling can be rather tedious and take up a lot of time sometimes, and so while you have some downtime, maybe you're waiting in a ticket queue, maybe your train got delayed, maybe it's something else. Use this time to mitigate some of the disadvantages we've been talking about. So for example, if you have encountered interesting words, phrases, or something else, look them up, actually create flashcards, write them down in a notebook, or do something with them so that they stay with you and don't just fade away. And my final tip for learning Chinese through traveling is to consolidate when you get back home. As I've already said, traveling will expose you to lots of new things, and many of these things you really want to learn, but you can't really learn all these things at once, and that really is the problem. You don't have the structure, you don't have the time to do it while traveling. So if you write them down, then you can consolidate when you get back home, and you'll probably find that the trip itself gave you a lot of motivation to learn these things, and even things beyond those things, and so a trip like this can power your learning for weeks, months, or even years after you come home. To conclude this episode, whether or not traveling is a great method of learning Chinese depends on how you travel and also how much Chinese you know before you set out. If you've spent some time learning Chinese on your own or in a course, but you haven't used it much, then traveling for a few weeks can actually make a huge impact on your ability to communicate in Chinese. On the other hand, if you haven't done this, or if you stick mostly to yourself or use English, then traveling might be nice for other reasons, but it won't really do much for your Chinese. So what's the bottom line here then? Well, I don't think it is to say that you shouldn't travel to learn Chinese. I just think that you should have realistic expectations of how much you will learn through traveling. And if you do travel, I think you should take into consideration the things we have talked about in this episode, especially then if your main goal is to improve your Chinese. I also want to take every opportunity I can to strike at the idea that language learning is somehow tied to a geographical location. So let's say you can't travel, maybe you can't afford it, it's not practical, you don't want to, or for some other reason you can't go traveling to learn Chinese. Well, you'll still be fine. There are many other ways to practice these things, and if you're not in an area where people speak Chinese around you, it takes a little bit more effort, but it's still definitely possible. And some things, as we have seen, are actually better learned at home. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.